Okay, so yesterday we started down the path of looking at a complete thought in C#, much like you would look at a complete sentence or thought in the English language. And I said something to the effect that just like you use a period at the end of a sentence in the English language, you use a semicolon at the end of a properly formed C# statement. I may have even briefly referred to statements in C# as having nouns and verbs and so forth, extending that analogy. And so I wanted to elaborate on that and clarify what I meant in this video, and hopefully by understanding a little bit more about the structure of a properly formed statement or instruction in C#, it'll help you write your own code. Okay, so let's start off just giving a basic hierarchy, the basic building blocks that make up a line of code. So statements are complete thoughts or complete sentences in C#. Statements are made up of one or more expressions. Expressions are made up of operators and operands. And so we've seen examples of all of these already in all the code that we wrote yesterday. I just want to take a few of these a little bit out of context and point out the various parts. So console.writeLine hello world. Here we have an operand and we have an entire expression which actually forms a statement as well. And if we look at the next one, if user value equals 1. The user value equals 1 is an expression. It's a part of the entire statement, not the entirety in and of itself. Just having that by itself means nothing. We'll come back to that in a moment. Y equals x plus 7. The x plus 7 part is a expression. The x part is a variable we created. That is an operand. The operator is the plus symbol. The my string equals Bob plus my last name. Okay, again, here's an expression. The Bob plus my last name is the expression. It's made up of operands and operators. The operands are literal strings like the literal string Bob, and the variable my last name, the operator, is the plus sign. And there are others. But the expressions have two things in common. They consist of operators and operands. Operands are things like objects. For now, just think of classes like the console class, or variables like or literal strings. Okay, I suppose you could call these the nouns within our complete sentence analogy. Operators are things like the plus operator, which when working with numeric data types indicates that you want to add the values together. The plus operator can also be used to concatenate strings together, like we saw in the example yesterday. There's the equal sign, which we already noted means variable assignment. So when I set x equals or y equals to x plus 7, we can see that we are assigning the value of x to y plus 7. We also worked with the if statement. We noted that the double equal sign means equality. So if we want to check the equality, it's different than making an assignment. We are evaluating the two against each other. Are they equal, or greater than or less than? Okay. And there are some other operators that we've seen, but you might not typically think of as an operator. For example, parenthesis. It's the operator for method invocation. It's what we use to pass our arguments to the parameters of a given method, such as the writeLine, for example. So what happened if we were to ignore those parameters? Well, it changes the meaning of our code, and quite frankly, C# would have no way of understanding that. Another operator is the dot operator, which means member access. So we use the console classes writeLine and readLine member methods. They are members of that class. Remember, we said that we're using the term class as an organizational unit around the methods within our applications. And so to access those methods that belong to the class, to the console class, you had to use a dot. And we'll be using the dot notation countless number of times over the next few weeks as we write code. All right, and there are quite a few operators, but as you start out, honestly, you probably only need to know about a dozen of them. So I just want to focus on a few for today. I'm going to kind of throw them at you in a rapid fire sequence, but we'll add them to our resource materials, the cheat sheet, into our memorization work, and hopefully you'll recall these when you need them. And if you don't recall them, we can always refer back to this video for a quick reminder. Okay, so again, rapid fire. This is an assignment operator. We are assigning the value of 3 to the variable x. This is an addition operator, the plus sign. We are adding two values together and then using the assignment operator, the equal sign, to assign that value to x. Okay, but the addition operator, plus sign, makes sense. Subtraction operator, similar. We are taking two values and subtracting one from the other. The multiplication operator is the asterisk. So that's how you multiply two numbers together. The division operator is a forward slash. That's how you divide one number into another. The equality operator is how you evaluate two operands against each other to see if that indeed is true or false. So the return value of the double equal sign will return true or false. It's either equal, those two values are equal, they're not equal. Equality operator. The greater or less than operators. X is greater than y, x is less than y. Again, simple mathematical operators. I'm sure that you've already encountered these in primary school. The greater than or equal to operator, or the less than or equal to operator. Okay, so here's some new ones that you may have not seen before. This is the conditional and operator. So in this particular little segment of code here, if x is greater than y and a is greater than b, then perform the block of code underneath the if statement. So that double ampersand is the and operator. Both of those conditions must equate to true in order for this statement to evaluate to true and therefore execute the code of the block of code below it. There's the conditional or operator, which are two pipe symbols. In my keyboard, they're above the backslash. And so in this case, if either one of these true statements are true, or I'm sorry, expressions are true, then execute the code block below the if statement. If x is greater than y or a is greater than b, either one of those, then we're good to go. So that's the conditional or operator. We use the conditional and conditional or a lot. Okay. And then there's this neat conditional operator. We'll come back to this later. This is kind of a shorthand for the if statement. Again, we'll come back to it later. You can set the message equal to either car or boat depending on the value of x. If it's equal to 1, then set it to car. If it's not equal to 1, then set it to boat. Again, great shorthand notation, eliminates a lot of keystrokes. A little cryptic, but definitely used all the time in C# code. Remember the dot notation. Console dot read line. That's how we get member access. We have a class and we want to access one of its members, one of its methods or properties. We'll talk about properties later, by using the dot notation for member access. And then also we said earlier that the parentheses are used for method invocation. So by virtue of the fact that we use the open and close parenthesis, or we even insert some arguments for the parameters, we are saying we want to call this method. We want it to perform its task. Okay. So you think you can memorize all of these? Well, I know you can. They're easy to memorize. Just give yourself a little time. You really need to memorize these. There's actually a much larger list, but 99% of the time, these are the operators that you're going to be using. Okay, so in each of these cases, an expression is made up of a combination of operands, again, literal strings, variables, objects like the console class, and operators, like we just looked at in that rapid fire sequence, the plus, the equal, the dot notation, parentheses, and so on. You use expressions to form statements, which is how the actions or instructions of an application are expressed in C#. We've already seen several great examples of statements so far. We looked at a few just a moment ago. But let's categorize some of these statements into a couple of buckets, just for the sake of understanding the taxonomy of statements. First, there's a code block, which is defined with curly braces. Now, we've seen how they're used in the namespace, in the class, and the method definition, as well as their use in if statements. So there are code blocks. That's one type of a statement. Then there are declaration statements. For example, int x. That's a declaration statement. You can combine that declaration statement with, what do we call that again? Initialization. Right. The next kind of the next kind of statement are expression statements. They're things like this line of code: my string equals first name, my first name plus my last name. Okay, there are expressions being evaluated and assigned. Another example of this is sum value equals 3 times x divided by 100. Now, I just want to say this briefly, that the same rules that apply in algebra with regard to the precedence and the order in which things are evaluated are true in C# as well. So in this case, you would multiply 3 times x because there's parentheses surrounding those, and then you divide that by 100. Okay. But even in hairier examples, the same precedence operators apply. Okay, then there are selection statements, and we've seen one example of this so far, the if statement, for example. We're going to add to this later today. If x is greater than y, then set z equal to the value Bob. There are iteration statements, which I'll show you later today, and there are a couple of others, but basically these are the syntax rules of C#. So what do I mean by that? Well, let me do this. You can't just say the red dog, period, in English. That's not a complete sentence. You can't say that. What happened to the red dog, right? Same is true with C#. You can't just write this, x plus y. And C#'s going to be like, have you lost your mind? That makes absolutely no sense. So for beginners, understanding that there's a proper syntax, just like there's a proper syntax and grammar in the English language, is a big step to helping you solve your own problems or phrasing C# instructions that the C# compiler will accept. Okay, so to recap, a couple of things. Statements are complete instructions in C#. They consist of expressions. A statement is like a sentence in the English language, and the expressions are things like nouns and verbs. And actually, expressions are made up of operands and operators. Operands are things like objects, that's number 2, or you can think of classes or variables or literal strings. These are kind of what we call the nouns, if you want to extend that analogy. Third, operators are like verbs. They act on the operands, and we spent quite a lot of time in this video looking at about a dozen or more operators, and we've been using operators for all sorts of purposes up until now, even if we didn't actually identify them that way. Number 4, you have to memorize the operators. Operands are like variables and classes and strings. They're easy to remember because you create those yourself. You're making up the names for them. But you have to memorize the operators because that's the way that you do something meaningful with your operands. Okay, so I just wanted to make those distinctions and to help you get a firmer grasp on the C# language itself. Next up, we're going to talk about data types and converting one type into another type. See you in the next video. Thank you.